everybody, to the GreenForges Interview Series, where we speak with key experts and entrepreneurs across the CEA and sustainability world to explore themes through which to disrupt and improve these industries. I am your host, Ramón Pereira Bonilla, the GreenForges Community Manager, and today I am joined by Sepehr Achard of iGrow News. How are you doing today, Sepehr?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm also doing great. It's a pleasure to be joined by you. Um, I wanted to start this conversation by just sort of diving a little bit into your background and then spending time chatting about uh, iGrow News and sort of why you took the site where it is now and what role you see it playing.
Sure. Um, I come from a very financial-oriented background. Most of my experience and my studies have been like in market research. And about during the pandemic, actually, during my last year of uni, I was actually writing sort of dissertation around financing in agriculture. And as I am a curious person, I started looking into like the various new technologies that were being introduced in the industry. And that's where I landed in indoor farming, and that's where I met iGrow News and the founder of iGrow News, Robert Kligerman. And yeah, um, I took over iGrow News about 2 years ago. Uh, the ambition was to really create an unbiased news platform, which is prevalent nowadays, because it's very complicated to be unbiased and to remain unbiased in today's world. So that's really something that we want to do. And now we've expanded beyond CEA. And since January, we talk about pretty much all the segments around the new technologies of agriculture. And on the side, we also collect a lot of data around the industry. And the purpose of it is that we provide also market research services for companies that wish to expand in a new market, introduce a new product or whatnot. And we leverage that database in order to provide these market reports. And that's about in a nutshell who we are. And yeah.
Yeah, no offense to previous GreenForge interview guests, but I have to say this is a conversation that I've been looking forward to for quite a while. I'm very excited because it feels like, given everything that you just said, you're very qualified to be able to, speak on the issues that we're going to speak on today. So, without further ado, let's get into our questions.
Yeah, sure.
So recently there has been some turbulence, if we can call it that, in the CEA space. A lot has been made about recent company failures or underperformance, and so I'd love to dive a little into two companies which I think have similar but different stories that can inform the conversation around this turbulence. So, Air Farms
Yeah.
and App Harvest have both recently faced uh, tough times. And so I'd love for you to just sort of give the audience a quick synopsis on where both of these organizations currently are, and then talk about the factors that led them to that position.
Okay. So right now, both of these organizations have not closed. However, they are facing some financial difficulties. App Harvest have faced a foreclosure notice, um, and letter of, how's it called, repayment from their main creditors regarding their facilities. Um, and Arrow Farms, on the other hand, has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Um, However, they're still in operation. It's just, I've been actually attending the Indoor AgTech conference, and there was their CMO and their CFO, now CEO as well. And apparently, it's business as usual. They're just going through a transition in order to kind of restore their financials and hopefully get together and continue their mission. App Harvest, yeah, they faced their foreclosure. They had some problems as well regarding their stock price, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, that's about where they are right now.
Thank you. Yeah, it's funny actually. Just last week I purchased some Aeroforms microgreens from Whole Foods, and I have to say, even though they are somewhat of a competitor, their food is quite delicious. So anyway, I'd love to talk about kind of what are the factors that led them there. There's a lot of conversations about interest rates, energy costs, expansion. What do you see as the diagnoses that has put them in the position that they're in right now?
Um, at the moment, I mean, they've had a sort of perfect storm of events. I mean, perfect, not in a good sense, but they had a storm of events because essentially their business model was extremely capital intensive, which was adapted to the period around 2019, 2020, where, or and even before that, where money was affordable and cash was available as well and available at low interest rates and with very little to no uh, background check. So the risk was available, and that's why they created these business models. However, the pandemic arrived, and then there was obviously the war between Russia and Ukraine, which spiked energy costs. Not really in the US, even though it had some impact, but it was very little compared to what happened in Europe, which obviously led to similar companies facing some disruptions as well. Um, so that's the one thing. And then obviously there was the inflation, hyperinflation period, and it's still undergoing. I mean, that led the central banks to try and control through tightening the economy. So I'm getting a little bit more technical here, but essentially, for the folks out there that don't really understand what's happening, the central banks are trying to control the inflation rates by increasing interest rates. And so it slows down the economy. However, it has impacts on businesses, and it has had obviously impacts on CEA and specifically in these two companies because they've had loans and to finance their facilities and so on. Arrow Farms, I'm not too sure because obviously they're not publicly traded, so they don't have to disclose the details of their financing. But App Harvest has had loans on several of their facilities, and some of them are now on a sale leaseback. So again, with the current interest rates and with the speech actually from the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, I think it was yesterday, they want to keep on increasing interest rates until they can get the inflation to 2%, which is kind of far away. And I don't see it easing anytime soon. So that will, again, put more pressure in the economy, more pressure on the industry, because obviously these companies will see their interest rates, specifically if they have like variable interest rate loans, they will see their interest rate spikes, their monthly spikes. We're talking about like a double digits increase. So anywhere between 10 to 25% increase in their monthlies, which is nothing if you borrow $10,000, but if you are in the millions or 10 millions or 100 millions, like App Harvest or all these companies are, then it can get quite complicated, especially if you're dealing with tight margins, like pretty much everyone in the produce industry.
Yeah, I appreciate you voicing that because it sounds like there's two, but mainly just one thing. You have the rise in energy prices, but then just this interest rate spike has been quite detrimental to some companies. And I think diving into that a little bit further around the kinds of investors and the kinds of company sort of growth that they hope to have can really
Mm-hmm.
help inform why that is the case. And so, I think pretty much everyone is familiar with the Silicon Valley venture capital motto, move fast and break things.
Yeah.
You can't really move fast and break things when you're growing people's food, right? When you have high rising interest rates, it's one thing if someone's dating app is, their profile picture is glitching. It's another thing if their lettuce is contaminated, right? Those are
Yeah.
two very completely different things. And so I'd love to use that as sort of like a segue to talk about traditional agriculture, because traditional agriculture, um, there's not that same sort of hyper growth mindset. There's more different traditional funds of resourcing, um, or sorry, traditional funds of source of funds, I should say. um, and so I'd love to talk to you about, you know, CEA integration with traditional farming, where the two industries rub up, where they intersect. I think right now the ethos is that CEA is sort of this new age of farming that in a not so distant future, agriculture will be entirely replaced by CEA, especially in urban centers. Do you think this is the right way to be thinking about this conversation? What is your general outlook on these two spaces?
Um, no, I don't think it's the right way. Um, I think it's pretty much delusional to think that way, that it's going to replace traditional agriculture. I think, as a lot of people have said, it's just another tool in your toolbox. Um, I don't see the billions of hectares of land that are used for crop growth being transposed into CEA, or whether it's a greenhouse or a vertical farm in an urban area or in an industrial zone. I don't see it. It wouldn't make a lot of sense. However, um, I think that people should start thinking in terms of like integrating with traditional agriculture, because the solution itself has potential, whether it's at the very beginning when you're growing from seed to like a sprout. For instance, agroforestry, there are some companies that are working in agroforestry. I think Intelligent Growth Solutions, the Scottish company, they're working in agroforestry, and apparently it's working pretty well, and it has shown proven results. There are obviously some crops where I think that inevitably it will be, hate using the word, but it will be replaced by CEA. But I don't think it's like, yeah, all the crops grown in traditional farms will be replaced and will be transferred in CEA. That's just delusional for me.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about, this sort of integration or like a hybrid model. I think to me that's really exciting because, you can ask any farmer out there, the scariest part of when you're planting is the moment where before the seed makes it out of the ground, right?
Yeah.
And so CEA can really play a crucial role there. Um,
Mhm.
you mentioned that, starting in January, iGrow News has started to have a wider breadth of the things that they cover. Are there any developments in that space in particular which you think are really exciting? What's your outlook there?
In traditional agriculture,
In traditional agriculture intersecting with CEA.
well, what we're seeing in terms of audience and in terms of speaking to people is that farmers are interested in CEA. They are really interested. To give you an idea, the proportion of our audience in January that were actual conventional farmers and that were subscribed to our indoor farming division, there were around 3%. In June, it increased up to 17%. That just shows how interested they are. And speaking to a lot of farmers, they're still interested. They're interested in trying out. They think it is part of the solution. They think it brings some solutions in terms of like, also in terms, we've talked about seed to seedling, but also in terms of guaranteeing a certain level of production, diversifying the crop range as well. That is important. And with everything that is happening in terms of climate change, in terms of droughts, in terms of pests, in terms of, yeah, pretty much everything that's occurred in the past few months and the past years, and that will occur in the next years as well, because it's not a one off thing, they are very conscious that they need to change and they need to adopt new technologies, including CEA. But again, thinking that CEA will replace traditional farming is just, for me, it's delusional. It doesn't make any sense. And it's just about integrating these solutions within the food production chain.
Yeah, certainly. I think CEA tends to the folks in CEA tend to sort of come off as like a little posh, or like a little like, like grand.
Hmm.
And I think, the statistic that you shared, from 3% to 17%, that's huge. And I think we can do more to bridge that gap between the two industries. And, at the end of the day, we're just trying to grow food and feed people, right?
Yeah.
If we have that shared goal, that shared foundation, I think the things that we can accomplish together are truly fascinating. Um, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about geography. Um, some folks in the audience might remember that during my conversation with Peter Lane, he talked about the importance of taking geography into account when building a CEA operation. Right, the business model that's going to work in Nebraska is not the same business model that's going to work in Singapore. It's not the same
Yeah.
business model that's going to work somewhere, in Europe. Um, and he then began to seemingly wax poetic a little bit around the North African countries. He saw that they have an advantage in cheap energy prices, and they're strategically located in terms of global logistics. How do you view the flood, or I guess the seeming flood of expansions into the Middle East? Do you agree with Peter's analysis of the Middle East promise?
Um, I think it is not complete. I appreciate Peter Lane, and he is a very well knowledgeable person, having talked to him. But here I think that is not a complete analysis. I mean, yes, there is the energy part, there is the global logistics part, but you have to take into account as well the demographics and the education levels in terms of like how people are willing or are used to listen to this fresh local greens type of communication.
Mm,
The reality in the Middle East, especially, and when we're talking about the Middle East, I mean, we're talking about like Gulf countries primarily, and then also the other countries in the Middle East. But that's where the most the spotlight has been on for the past couple of years. Over there, okay, there's probably one third of the population that is listening to this model um, in terms of uh, yeah, having this local food, fresh food, green food, and so on, and they're willing to listen to this and willing to pay a premium. However, there is the two-thirds of the populations that come from other countries and developing countries like India, Bangladesh, and others. At the end of the day, they don't care whether it comes from here or there or somewhere
mm,
else. As long as it's
mm,
cheap, they're willing to
mm,
pay for it. And that's where you get into a situation where when you work in retail shops and so on, and when you sell in retail shops, you're in competition with pretty much everyone. And it is a free market. There's no restrictions, there's nothing that will restrict that. And having lived there for around 15 years, specifically in the UAE, you have the options between your head of lettuce that will cost a couple of cents in terms of dollars, and yeah, the fresh green that is produced in a CEA facility, but that costs one, two, three, $4.
right.
You have the option. Statistically speaking, let's be honest, people will always majority they will go to the cheapest option,
Sure.
and that is the reality that we see over there. So people have to take into account, okay, yeah, there is cheap energy. There is as well an interest in terms of like when you look at the missions that the governments have in terms of like, yes, we want to ensure food security and we want to ensure a food supply and so on. But then again, you have to take into account the realities over there on the field, kind of, and consider the fact that, yeah, more than two-thirds of the population don't even care of whether it's from a CA facility or whether it's imported from another country and traveled thousands of miles. They don't care about this. They care about the price. That's all they care about.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's sort of become like a iconic tension within the CEA space is how do we balance the fact that this food is just expensive? It's expensive to grow, it's expensive to consume. Um, with the fact that it's quote unquote better for the environment. It's local. It feels good to consume it. And I think that's one of the questions that regardless of what firm you are, you're dealing with.
Hmm.
And one of the things that has been proposed is trying to avoid the retailers going direct to consumers. That tends to limit some of those constraints, but it still has its own limitations. Folks
Hmm.
can check out our interview with Vladimir Keverin from Sponex. He's experimenting with some of that. We have quite an extensive conversation around that. But on the topic of localism, or I should say, yeah, of localism, I wanted to ask you, what does that really mean to you? What does being local mean? Because we see everywhere locally grown, locally harvest, and then we dig into the specifics and we find that local does not always meet our expectations. It's not always what we think it is. So, what does localism mean to you? And then, what role do you see localism fulfilling within the CEA space?
Um, I mean, in terms of like what it means to me, it means that it comes from the region you are living in, or at least the state. I mean, if you're in the United States, at least the states you're living in. That's what it means. But then again, there needs to be a clear definition of what local is, because
Mm,
obviously, when you look into urban farming and so on, one of their key messages is that, yeah, they want to make it local and so on. But okay, is local having food at your doorsteps, or
mm,
is local being 50 kilometers around, 100 kilometers around, 200 kilometers around?
mm,
Is local relevant with the advent of like new forms of transportation
mm,
that have less carbon emissions? These are all questions that need to be asked, and obviously there needs to be a clear definition of what local is. And in terms of like how CEA can get into it, I think like for the first time we can localize agriculture wherever people are.
mm,
You know, you can have a sort of, I mean, I don't know if we can call it agriculture or like a small foods production system, even on the ISS in space. All right.
right.
You can have it in Antarctica, you can have it in the middle of the desert.
Mm,
Um, so that's the advantage of CEA. So it's really in this local trend and localism trend.
mm,
Now the question is local being in the city, which I think in previous discussions with Peter Lane, you've talked about like the problems there were with regards to the capital expenditure and so on.
mm,
There are also some other structural, perhaps, issues in terms of like, okay, the buildings need, if you're reusing, for instance, a commercial facility, you need to study the buildings and the structure, and you need to ensure that it can withstand the load that is going to be put in, whether it's a traditional rooftop garden, whether it's a vertical farm, whether it's whatever it is. You need
mm,
to make those calculations and you need to ensure. So, not all properties are meant to be like this, especially when you look in Europe. There are a lot of old um, buildings and so on that are 100, 200 years old. And
mm.
200 years ago, they haven't had this issue. So,
Yeah,
so yeah, there needs to be all these questions asked, in my opinion.
yeah, yeah. I think it's it's such a harsh reality when we have this sort of like utopian vision of like greenhouse on the rooftops and greens everywhere and yada yada yada. But when you're faced with the like hard economic and logistical facts of the things, it's not as easy as just putting a greenhouse on top of a building, or just
Yeah,
oh, there's enough. But go
I
ahead.
mean, in terms of like, sorry, but in terms of like, when you look at um, what these companies do, like these urban farming companies do, I think in France, there's been a report from media called AgriCity, and they've stated that two-thirds of these urban farms, their main sources of revenue was not from farming, It was from the event services or all the things around that, right? Because they would host after hours for companies. They would host
Mm,
like what do they call this? Team building sessions or whatever it is.
right.
And that's where most of their revenue comes from. So it's not actually from farming; it's from other stuff. And again, in terms of like production rates, maybe for your microgreens or so on, it makes sense because it is
Yeah.
something very fragile and it's something that, okay, it needs to be located around your customers. But then for the rest, I mean, in terms of like moving all the leafy greens production in in cities, for me, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah,
Or
definitely.
or or we need to change completely. I mean, people don't realize this, but if it is the case, if people want to have farming within cities, we need to change the complete regulations, the food systems, the food supply chains, and it requires trillions of dollars, not just a couple of $1 million or so on. No, it's trillions of dollars. I mean, in France, for instance, to have a farm and to be considered as a farm, you need to have three conditions met. Like you need first of all to be certified as a farmer, so go
Mm,
through an education process and so on. Second of all, you need to be uh, in an agricultural zone and have farmland. And
mm,
third, you need to prove that the system that you're trying to build, whether it's a vertical farm, a hydroponic system, an aquaponic system, whatever it is, you need to prove that it's beneficial for your farm.
mm.
So that needs to be changed. There's also all the food grade and food
Yes.
um, security and hygiene stuff that needs to be met as well, because this is a shady area of
Yeah.
CEA that needs to change. So people don't realize all the work that needs to be done, but it's a complete shift in terms of like what we need to change in today's world.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you voiced that because I think in the U.S. in general, we're facing a huge housing affordability crisis, and right now, commercial real estate in particular, like these office buildings, it's
Mm,
essentially a ticking time bomb. You know, they don't have their vacancy rates are through the roof because
yeah,
the nature of work has changed since COVID, and one possible solution that has been floated out there is like, okay, we have a shortage of housing, we have all these empty buildings, transform them into residential. But even if, putting aside the architectural and logistical challenges of doing that, there's zoning laws that need to be changed. And that red tape
sure.
takes time to break down. And so when you look at it through the lens of agriculture, there are so many restrictions that go into place that, um, you know, we are facing real challenges and we need to be moving much, much faster than these laws allows us to do. So I'm glad that you just sort of verbalized just how tricky the challenge is.
But I
With
mean,
that being, sorry, go ahead.
in terms of like when you look in the past, there are some past events that have forced us to change quickly. And when I
Mm,
say quickly, is a matter of months.
mm,
If we all get together and if we understand how critical the problem is, and
right.
that is during COVID for the
Mm,
vaccination programs. We've certified some vaccination and some vaccines in a couple of months, whereas it
yeah.
would have taken years and years to certify them. So there is a precedent in terms of like moving fast.
Mhm.
It's all about like people wanting to move fast and wanting to change things pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You took the words out of my mouth because I think to me that's what keeps me hopeful about this because I have faith in people being able to recognize the seriousness of the challenges in front of us and being able to move out
Mm-hmm.
of tradition, old ways to really uh, make way for the changes that we need. Um, you know, I wanted to end this conversation a little selfishly around GreenForges in particular. Like we mentioned, AgRow News is a news site that talks all about CEA and other forms of agriculture. And so I wanted to spend, these last few minutes we have together just getting your unabashed views on GreenForges and our business model, sort of as if you were just putting together an article for us. Um, so, for those of those for those in the audience who don't know about the GreenForges business model, and GreenForges is developing the world's first below-ground vertical farming systems. So we drill about a 1.5 meter diameter hole that goes about 100 feet deep. And then we stick a steel casing in there and line it. Actually, I have a cup right here that'll serve as a model. So 1.5 meter diameter, 100 feet deep, and then we line it with growing modules and use that to grow food. While we're still in our pre-pilot phase, we really see our go-to-market as partnering directly with real estate developers to build and operate these farms, which can be directly integrated with their communities. And so we see this for three reasons. First, we can use the same equipment that these developers use to drill the foundations of their buildings to drill the holes for the forges. That's kind of our biggest capital expenditure as a business model. Second is we see a lot of potential for recycling heat in and out of our GreenForges. So as we mentioned, a lot of farms, a lot of CA operations have been struggling with the volatility of energy prices. Because we are underground, we have some natural insulation effects that occur that can reduce our energy costs by 25 to 35%. And, the waste heat that is generated by these LED lights can be integrated with the above ground HVAC systems to cycle that heat and create more of a circular effect, bringing down the cost of both the farm and the above ground systems. And then lastly, we are farming as a service. We're not like traditional CE operations that want to own and operate the farm directly. We see ourselves as partnering with this real estate developer, putting together a separate legal entity that would be considered the farm, and then we would handle the various responsibilities of hiring the folks to run the farm, collecting the data, logistics, et cetera, et cetera. With all that being said, I would love to just hear your overall thoughts on our company, our business model, and just your thoughts in general.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of leveraging natural heat and natural insulation is a good idea, I think. At the end of the day, it is space that is not used. When you think of building or so on, it is within their process, so it's not adding something completely new. It is within their building process. Obviously the main worry that there can be is around the cost of drilling, putting that 100 feet down. That's obviously the main pain point, I think. But other than this, and then, the logistics of going up and down and so on, it requires something. In terms of the business idea and so on, I think it is well adapted within the challenges that there is. I mean, you've mentioned the commercial real estate issues and so on. And I'm in New York right now, and I see around all streets, there is commercial real estate to lease, commercial real estate to rent, to sell as well. It's all around the place.
Right.
So in terms of it is adapted to the current issues. The only thing is, obviously now, and pretty much since the 2008 or 2008 real estate crisis, in a lot of countries there are some restrictions in terms of building or construction of buildings. I don't know in the US or in Canada if there is, but in France there are some. So that's the only limitation. I mean, the only limitation, it's that you're liable to these regulations and so on. Other than this, it makes sense.
All right, so we have your stamp of approval. Got it. Well, Seth, it was beyond of a pleasure to be able to sit down with you today. I really can't thank you enough. I hope we get to do it again in the future.
Sure.
Feel free to shout out, where folks can find your stuff, any other things you would like to leave folks with, and then close it out.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they can read on iGrownews.com. They got pretty much all the information they want over there. And they can access our newsletters, our services as well if they're interested in market research. And it was a pleasure to talk to you today.
Awesome. I'm happy to hear it. And Thank you folks for joining in on our conversation. We look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye guys.